So this subassembly is an example of a jack shaft. It's a different type of jack shaft. In this case, now it seems a little bit like it's got a lot of stuff happening here, but actually it's relatively simple. Now, one thing I will tell you is this piece of tube, I just stuck that piece of tube in there because I was wanting to verify that I had enough clearance here between my swing arm and that. So because I'm going to have to keep in mind the motorcycle frame will be supporting this. So you're going to have vertical and horizontal tubes in here some way. So these plates, they're very clunky and rectangular. They're going to look much different when you're done. The center to center distance could be, it's probably really close, and the size of the holes is probably correct, but the rest of it, it's just part of the design right now. So a couple things. You want to try to make sure that this assembly is no wider. In fact, my goal here was to make this the same width as the swing arm. This shouldn't be a lot wider, and it's probably almost impossible to make it narrower because you've got a lot of stuff you're packing in here. Really, really important that whatever you do here, this sprocket has to line up with that sprocket. So if you want to put a plane on that face and look at that to make sure that that lines up, it's a really good idea. So if I were to put a plane on that surface, stretch that out. One of my goals here is, when I'm totally done with my design, that lines up perfectly, and this one does. That means when I put the chain on there, I'm not going to have any issues with alignment, and it's going to clear the frame. That's the other reason I put that tube in there, so your chain can go up and down and doesn't hit anything. So that's really important to have that lined up. So you can just take your subassembly that you already have with your swing arm and then kind of build that around here, right? This again has a fair amount of parts in it, but if you think about those couple of basic ideas. So the way that this functions, let's turn that off for now. The way this functions is there's two things. So there's a shaft here. Right, so there's an inner shaft. And that shaft rides on that bushing. That bushing prevents steel against steel interaction. So that will allow this swing arm to pivot, and the same thing is happening over here. Now what I did was I just drilled and tapped. So I also have a washer on that. Drilled and tapped the end of that, and notice how there's space for that bushing to go in there. Let's see, where is that bushing? I'll turn it back on. And I grabbed those bushings from McMaster-Carr. So that bushing there has a shoulder on it as well. So that'll rest up against the plate. So that will prevent steel on steel interaction. So I can screw that down. So the shaft will be fixed, and then the swing arm will be able to pivot around that. And that's the idea with that. So that'll allow my suspension to cycle up and down. So that handles that right there. That little assembly there handles the ability for this shaft to pivot. Now over here I have a different shaft. This shaft is my drive shaft. So this chain is going to come from the engine. It's going to wrap around. Oops, hang on a second. I got something weird right there. I inserted two sprockets. Sorry. So I have a bearing. And I have a bearing there. Those are the same. Those are going to be mounted inside that plate. That particular bearing has a set screw on, so I can lock it on the shaft so it can't fall apart. So there's a keyed shaft. There's going to be two sprockets on there. One that's driven by the motor because it's keyed to the shaft. When that sprocket rotates, the shaft will rotate and that sprocket will rotate. And the chain will go from there to there, and that'll make your vehicle go. So that is going to handle driving the rear end. This is going to allow the swing arm to pivot. So that's the idea here with this. So two shafts. This is the rotating shaft, and that shaft just allows the swing arm to pivot. I've got these bushings on here to help two things: to line up the sprocket, and you can make these bushings any thickness that you want to kind of, if you want to move the sprocket back and forth. And then it's got a set screw on, so you would lock it down. And Also, to keep steel against steel, you don't want the sprocket rubbing on the bearing. Okay, so, and again, this particular bearing that I chose has set screws in it, so you just lock it down on the shaft once you have the thing assembled. So when you're done, let's see, where's my plate there? So pretty simple parts. You've already got the swing arm designed. This is just a straight shaft that's drilled and tapped on the two ends with a bolt and a washer on it. Bearing, which I got out of a catalog. Sprockets, you can make your own or you can get them from a catalog. Bushings that you need to design. A shaft you need to design. Some keys to put in there. So those are the parts. Now, once again, this is eventually going to have to fit in your frame. So it's not, this plate's not going to be this rectangle we're done, but we'll know the geometry of that plate and how it fits together, right? So it's just, you know, part of the process here is I can't look forward and see exactly. I don't have my frame designed yet. So if I get the swing arm done, the next step is going to be fit that in the frame. But I did do this thing where I put this tube in there just to make sure that I wasn't, you know, again, this swing arm has to be able to go up and down. And the chain needs to be able to go around this. So whatever you have going on here, that's why if you'll notice, there's an angle here. Because my chain, let's go to the other side, my chain is going to have to, let's turn off that plate right there. The chain is going to have to go from that sprocket, it'll go over that shaft, it'll go over the shaft, around there and under that. So that's why there's a little bit of an angle. And I'll show you, let's see, what was I going to do? Let me do an exploded, and then I'll show you how I arrived at that angle. Okay, so I've just isolated this jackshaft subassembly. This tube here is the main tube, that pivot tube of your swing arm. So the two arms come off of this. So if you see, let's see what is inside there. You can see all the pieces. So again, this shaft here, which is bolted to the plate through here, you can see those holes are tapped, the bolts and washer. There's a bushing that goes on there on both ends, and that allows this tube to sit on in contact with those bushings. So this tube, which is, again, that's your pivot tube of your swing arm, that allows the swing arm to move up and down as your suspension travels. Now this is your drive shaft, so the sprocket is going to be driven by the chain on the motor. There's a key in there. That shaft will rotate, turn the key, and turn the other sprocket. There's a bushing in here that just keeps it's a spacer between the sprocket and this bearing. And the bearing fits in that hole. So when you choose a bearing, that hole in there will fit the OD of that. The ID of this bearing is 3/4 because I'm using a 3/4 shaft. Okay, same with this. This ID fits the OD of the shaft, the OD of that. Oops, yeah, the OD of that fits the ID, so got it. This tube has the bushing in it, and then the shaft fits inside there. So if I'm starting with, I think that's a 1-inch tube, you can work your way backwards. I think this is 0.875 ID, which means that's 0.875, and I think that's a 3/4 or 5/8 shaft, so that'll match that bushing. So it's really up to you. And those sprockets, I don't remember how many tooth. 16 or something sprocket. I had to make those bigger sprockets because you can't use like a 12 tooth or something, because now in this case the chain is going to have to go around this tube, remember. So I'm not 100% sure this is going to work. Let's hide that again and let's see. Hide that bearing too. So when that thing is sitting like that, when you put the chain on, you got to make sure it's going to clear this shaft. It looks like we're okay. If not, we just would make that, we'd get a bigger sprocket. Okay, so that kind of be up to you to figure some of these things out, right? Okay, so there's your exploded view of the jack. So that's what we really need to design, is this sub-assembly here. And you're going to have to take some liberties and some guesses on some of these sizes. Don't use humongous material. I think this is 3/16 thick or something like that. Just don't make it like 1/2 inch thick or anything. Remember, I think this bearing is 1/2 inch, so that might be at most 1/4. Don't use anything thicker than like 1/4 of an inch. These spacers, you can make them whatever you want. Remember, that's going to prevent metal to metal. It's also going to help you line up this sprocket. You want to have a positive stop there. You don't just want to count on your set screw to make sure that the sprocket isn't going to get away from you. So when I was thinking about this design, and it's very functional. In fact, you'll see variations of that. I showed you some photos of some different bikes that have something similar. The question is like, what kind of dimensions to use here? And this is non-critical, other than, you know, make sure this isn't going to crash into the shock, and also this is going to have to make sure that your swing arm isn't going to hit your frame. So this needs to be close to the edge. I don't know about this. I'm probably tighten this up. I think that's a little bit more space than I need. And then the size holes, that hole in that plate fits the hole in the bearing, right? And this hole is just going to be a clearance hole to allow you to put that bolt into that inner shaft, right? Remember, that's inner shaft is bolted together with that right there. Okay. So I was trying to figure out, the question I had was about this angle. Again, it has to be an angle to allow the chain to go around. So you can just fiddle around with it or guess on something. What I actually did was I found this bike, and it's pretty simple, but also looks like it would work. And that looks familiar too. So we're gonna have something like that. Now I know what your frame rail is gonna do. Your frame rail may not go straight up. It might be at an angle or whatever. So this plate will have to be designed a little bit later. But I was looking for that angle. I actually took this, cut and pasted. I pasted it into AutoCAD, and then I just drew a straight line through there, and I drew a horizontal line, and I measured that angle, and that's how I came up with the angle that I'm using. And again, you can make that angle a lot of things, but that's how I arrived at the angle that I did. Okay, so parts that need to be designed, the plates obviously, and again, these are going to be revised as we go. You need to create these shafts. The bushings, you can make those, or you can grab them from a vendor. I just made some simple bolts, simple washer. That bearing I got from the vendor, you can put some kind of a dummy in there. It's a simple block to represent your bearing. Just make sure that the size you choose is actually available to purchase as a bearing. Same with those bushings, I made those. The sprockets, I made those. That shaft, it's a simple shaft with a keyway. Got in it. Remember, for the size of a key, the size of a key is 1/4 of the diameter. If you have a 1-inch shaft, it's a 0.25 by 2.25, sorry, 0.25 by 0.25 square key. If it's 3/4, if you take 3/4 divided by 4, it's going to be a 3/16 key that fits in there and so forth. So I have 2 separate keys in there. I could have had 1 big long key, but I have 2 little keys that I put in there. I'm not too worried about that. If you constrain it to the key, you won't be able to spin the sprocket. So that one I constrained to the key, and that one I didn't. So keys in there, I just didn't constrain it. Okay, so ultimately what we're looking for is to have that assembly that makes sure all the parts fit together to create that jack shaft, and do the best you can. For now, again, the overall width, try to keep this width of this close to the width of your swing arm, plus or minus a little bit, because that's going to be relative to the width of your frame, which we're going to work on here soon. And we can always change. If we have to change it, we just change the lengths of these shafts and tubes, and that's simple enough. So we may not get it right the first time, but we'll have the basics of something that will function. So I don't know what these dimensions, what they're going to be, but I think this is ballpark. Again, I'd probably make this a little bit tighter. The angle I think works. Plus or minus something would certainly work. You just probably can't have these 2 holes lined up horizontally, these 2 shafts, because then the chain is going to hit. So remember, the chain has to be able to go around that sprocket. So hopefully that helps with an idea about a jack shaft.